Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor, a podcast where I want to think more deeply with you about Christian faith and life. Hey, all you believers, you non-believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers, welcome. Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor. Before I dive into Paul the Apostle on sexual sin, if you didn't listen to my previous episode, please do. This show today could seem jarringly abrupt without the context of that prior one, so that background can be very helpful for understanding today's episode. My question as I start thinking through this issue is human nature real? Does human nature factually exist? Or is it, as the nihilists propose, merely a construct of our collective imagination? I know you know, but it is now standard fodder in public education and universities to say that there is no such thing as human nature. Instead, august-seeming professors argue there is only human natures. We are told that every single person who ever lived is particularly unique and indefinable. In other words, each person is their own nature. Now, obviously, science doesn't agree with that. Science says we are all 99.99% of us either male or female. There are several different dimorphous chromosomal possibilities other than the predominant XX female and XY male. The most common of those rare dimorphous possibilities is 1 in 1,000. The more rare is 1 in 130,000. But biology says all people have a heart and a spleen and a brain. Well, we would think. Science says we all gestate in our mother's womb, get delivered vaginally, that is across human history anyway. We're all born helpless infants, and then we grow and develop and eventually become what can occasionally be discerned in society, adults. We adults will be strong and vital for a season, but then our bodies and minds grow more rigid and eventually weaken and atrophy. I wish someone had told me not to get old. For goodness sake, what happens to our bodies? But all of this process is all inevitable, and it stems from our ontology as human beings. But there's more hardwiring than even that. Most of the planet, as made evident through their religion's teachings, most of the planet recognizes that human nature is somehow spiritual. For its part, the Bible is aware that human nature is far more than mere physiology. There really is something transcendent about us. We are spirit bodies or embodied spirits. Created for God, we are also hungry. And often, we are hungry for far more. We want so badly. Oh, we are so hungry. We are hungry for our mother's milk, and then food, and then relationship, and then intimacy, and with intimacy, meaning and purpose, and still more transcendence. Spiritual bodied selves that we are, we will try to sate and quench those hungers and thirsts with every conceivable manner of effort. Right? We'll take material things and use them to try to satisfy immaterial yearnings. We'll grasp for less tangible things like power and influence and status, but in the end, they too fail to fill up the hole in our soul that aches for transcendence. Today I'm going to show you that St. Paul the Apostle, both said more than Jesus, but stayed true to Jesus' teaching. And I have to warn you up front, this episode will get into some technical biblical exegesis. Though I've lectured on the Bible and sex for years, in preparation for this episode, I've done some further serious digging. And this is an important matter for our day. So I think it's both wise to be current and prudent to check one's prior conclusions. And I want to share some of that investigation with you. Undoubtedly, you've heard the old adage, the devil is found in the details. But I've put that saying into a more positive light. Truth and beauty are found in the details. Rarely is life abidingly meaningful at the surface level. And concerning something as important as human sex and what it means to be human, we don't do well to generalize. Those of us who take the Bible as God's Word do well to know specifically, carefully, detailedly what it teaches about sex. Oh, and I'm sorry about so many early qualifiers, but today's episode will be primarily biblically investigative. We Christians really do need to think pastorally about human sexuality, and please know I'm going to do that in a later episode. Some folks get nervous when they want pastoral guidance but only get exegesis, and other people get nervous when they only get pastoral info but want straight biblical exegesis. Today's going to be on the latter. So let's dig in. First, Paul in Romans 1 verses 22 through 28. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in the sinful desires and passions of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Verse 26. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind so that they do what ought not to be done. That's the New International Version. Now, please know that the broad context of this passage is that throughout his letter to the Roman believers, Paul teaches that there is no salvation outside of Christ. There's the broadest theme of the letter to the Romans. But more narrowly in this passage, and this passage echoes several others he wrote, Paul says sexual immorality can bar us from God's salvation. Just like Jesus, Paul taught that impulses and behaviors can move us outside of God's fold, God's family. And whereas Paul's understanding of salvation was exclusively rooted in Christ, he will teach, as Jesus did, that sex is an act exclusively reserved for a man and a woman. Indeed, the problem of sexual sin, Paul teaches here, involves everyone, men and women. Paul says even women are involved in sexual immorality. Now, in other of his letters, Paul calls out adultery and prostitution. But the specific sexual immorality that is at hand here is departing from the created order. If you read the passage yourself, you'll see that Paul is clearly alluding to Genesis 1 and 2. And maybe you might want to consider the episode I have on Genesis 1 and 2. But here in Romans 1, he will refer to Genesis, and he'll do the same thing again later in Romans chapter 5. So Genesis 1 and 2 is in the back of Paul's mind as he pens this letter. But here in chapter 1, you guys, He quotes 5 Greek words directly from the Septuagint's translation. The Septuagint was the first century Hebrew Bible put into Greek. It's called the Septuagint. Sometimes you'll see it denoted in literature as LXX, and I won't go into what all that means and why. But here Paul quotes 5 Greek words from Genesis 1. Mankind, anthropon, image, icona, likeness, homoisin, birds, petenon, and reptiles, herpeton. Why does his quoting those 5 words matter? Well, it lets us know Paul is thinking like a first century Jew on the topic. He's quoting the Septuagint. He's quoting the Jewish Bible. And again, his point is that the sin being committed is against nature. In Greek, paraphusin. It's, verse 26, unnatural. Or sometimes in English that is translated as contrary to nature. From a broader perspective, Paul is showing us that a theological error has led to sexual immorality. They should have known, even by observing nature, that sex was for male and female. But they have turned to idolatry, and so they are having sex contrary to nature. Well, what's going on contextually? What's going on in Paul's Gentile, right, his non-Jewish context? What was he witnessing in Corinth from where he wrote the letter to the Romans, or what's going on in Rome that would cause him to pen this? Well, please, again, sorry, go listen to my immediately preceding episode on Paul and his Gentile contexts. But we know, even from extra-biblical texts, even from authors outside of the Bible, that the first century Gentile world was often characterized by unrestrained sexuality. Men, ancient non-biblical writers would tell us, would get bored with sex with women. And in part, that was because men viewed women as less than men in terms of status, and then men viewed women as more unclean than men. And so men sought sex with one another. But Paul says more than that. Paul says the inflamed lust occurring here was not limited to men. Paul includes the phrase, even their women. Now, female homosexual sex was rare in the ancient world, and so it's hardly ever commented on by Gentile writers. What is known about female homosexual sex is that it was mutual and not pederastic. And I explained pederasty in my former episode. So that Paul points out here, quote, even their women, goes toward both his point about the sinful excess he's witnessing and his implied argument that the sin committed concerns God's created order, which is sex is exclusive for male with female and female with male. There's what Paul's saying. He's saying this what's going on here is outside of God's created order. It doesn't fit. It's not right. Well, let's work through some interpretations that are bandied about today. You might hear these in a sermon at different churches, or read about them in Christian magazines or the like. So I want to work through some interpretations you might hear today, some erroneous interpretations. And the first one is, was Paul addressing a cultural violation? It's not uncommon today to hear someone interpreting Paul and Paul's phrase paraphusin, against nature, to mean that there was something wrong with sexual behavior within a Greco-Roman context. Again, as though the against nature problem here is a cultural violation. But actually, no, Paul, by framing this in light of Genesis, which we see through those 5 Septuagint words, Paul, by framing this in light of Genesis and God's order for humanity, he lets us know that this is a topic that transcends culture. That's a foundational, critical point for our understanding of this passage. It wasn't a cultural violation that troubled Paul's observation. Rather, it was a moral violation that broke from God's created order. And I hope you get the nuance here. If this is only a first century contextual problem that Paul is addressing, then it can today more easily be dismissed. But again, that's not how Paul is framing this topic. Because you see, the phrase against nature, paraphusin, was not a phrase original to Paul. 300 years before Paul, Plato used that phrase in a discussion about same-sex intercourse. Or other ancient Gentile authors used paraphusin against nature to indicate and critique immoral sex. Second Enoch, an end of the first century Jewish pseudepigraphic apocalyptic text, say that fast 3 times, end of the first century Jewish pseudepigraphic apocalyptic text. I can't take the time to explain what all that means, but Second Enoch, a text which was not influenced by Paul's writings, but indeed deeply Jewish, denotes sex with a child as a sin that is paraphusin, against nature. Still further, Professor Preston Sprinkle, in his book, People to be Loved, Why Homosexuality is Not Just an Issue, he shows that paraphusin was never used in Paul's ancient world by Jews or Gentiles about heterosexual sex. Against nature was a phrase used exclusively about erotic same sex. And Dr. Sprinkle added, quote, Paul is hardly making an original contribution to theological thought on the subject, end quote, because the entire ancient world held a negative judgment of same-sex relations. So, all of that to say, Paul wasn't writing about violating Roman cultural customs. Paul was saying what many writers said in the ancient world. This breaks with the order. Secondly, was Paul concerned about temple prostitution? And this is important for our own 21st century context because some scholars argue that Paul is here in Romans prohibiting homosexual prostitution or homosexual temple prostitution, but the fact is, Paul doesn't at all describe homosexual prostitution here. Now, in 1 Corinthians 6, he's going to condemn, in 1 Corinthians 6, he's going to condemn temple prostitution, but not here. Neither does Paul in Romans describe men having sex with boys, a rather institutionalized practice called pederasty. And sorry, please go listen to my former episode because I go into detail about pederasty was. Romans 1 here wasn't about homosexual prostitution or a kind of superior-inferior sexual arrangement, pederasty. Rather, that Gentiles were exchanging the glory of animals and created things for the glory and truth of God, while it was idolatrous in Paul's mind. He's not referring to religious rituals. He doesn't describe any temple cultus, practice, accoutrement, put that in your French pipe and smoke it, or temple prostitution. So the context here is not about temple prostitution, heterosexual or homosexual. Third, is Paul here concerned about rape or coerced sex? Because some contemporary pastors and scholars argue that the contextual problem here is sex in general that is against people's will, we need to be clear. Paul is not here in Romans saying that if the sex is mutual, it's acceptable. We strain credulity to say that Paul meant if the extramarital sex is between committed Christians, then it's acceptable. Professor Sprinkle astutely noted, quote, when Paul describes other pagan vices such as murder, envy, deceit, covetousness, and slander, which if you keep reading in Romans 1:29 through 31, he lists those off. This does not mean that these acts are fine if they are committed by loving Christians, end quote. Or the way that I've said it, the Uncensored Unprofessor has said it for years about all kinds of Christian beliefs and practices, is that just because a Christian is doing it does not make it Christian. Just because a Christian is doing it doesn't make it Christian. For instance, just because an individual Christian believes that there are many paths to salvation does not at all mean that that is a Christian belief. Or just because it is a Christian who is sinning does not at all mean the behavior is somehow holy. So just because a Christian is doing it does not make it Christian. To argue as though it were, to argue that because a Christian is doing it is a one-for-one with the fact that it's holy, would be to express moral relativism, something the Bible would uniformly find very foreign. So to summarize, in Romans 1, Paul, with his eye directed towards sinful Gentile behavior, Paul says that homosexual sex, whether by men or, his words, even women, violates God's created order. The passions that inflame that sexuality is immoral, and the actions that result from those desires and passions are also against God's creation. Both Paul's linguistic context here in Romans 1 and his historical context, him being a first century Jew who studied and memorized and revered the Old Testament, sustain that interpretation. Any interpretations that move away from that understanding, that this is a violation of God's created order, is erroneous. It is not God's will for people to engage in homosexual sex, and it's not God's will for us to lust after one another. For his part, earlier, Jesus condemned heterosexual lust in his Sermon on the Mount. Paul is here in Romans condemning homosexual sinful desires. And it's actually not hard to see how both Jesus and Paul were consistent with the Old Testament, because in Moses' 10 Commandments, it said, "Do not covet." And to covet is to wrongly, sinfully desire. So there's erroneous, sinful desiring that can take place. Now, we all know that actions are more grave, actions are more problematic for human society than impulses and desires. There's a whole nother episode to think through. There's too many Christians who think all sins are equal, and they're not. Some actions have a greater effect upon people and society than other actions, and actions clearly have a more grave, dire impact upon society than does thinking or appetites or passions or desires. But the Bible, in its godly wisdom, teaches us that we need to guard our hungers and desires too. If we think this through, based on Paul's teaching in Romans 1, it's wrong to tell people that they can fulfill their hunger for sexual intimacy in a homosexual manner. Based on his writings, Paul would never affirm a gay couple getting married. Instead, human sex, Paul affirms, following Jesus' own teaching, human sex is reserved for a man and a woman inside the covenant of marriage. Christian teaching across the centuries was correct to have affirm this interpretation. There's Paul in Romans 1. It's some stiff medicine. The two other pertinent places where Paul touches upon homosexual sex, are 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10, and 1 Timothy 1, 9 through 11. Now, first let me do some general framing regarding both passages, 1 Corinthians 6, 1 Timothy 1. Both passages are 100% harmonious with Paul's teaching elsewhere. That is, Christians' bodies belong to Jesus, the one who bought them with his blood atonement. Christians are not free to engage extramarital sex, whether heterosexual or homosexual. And Paul never qualifies his teaching regarding that. So these passages here are consistent with Paul elsewhere. B, both 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1 involve what scholars call sin lists. Sin lists. And sin lists are just itemized sin without clarification or explanation. And if we read through the New Testament epistles, we'd see there are multiple sin lists. And in this case, both of Paul's passages name homosexual sex, although 1 Corinthians names both heterosexual and homosexual sex. But sin lists always reaffirm what the Old Testament taught about sins that can cut one off from God. So these are both sin lists. And then C, by way of some general framing, in both these passages, Paul addresses homosexuality and uses vocabulary that is significant for a contemporary Christian understanding of homosexual activity, and these terms are malakoi and arsenokoites. Now, Paul does not explain either of these terms, so we have to appeal to some historical context to understand them. I go into depth about both these terms in my previous episode, but briefly here I will say malakoi is the plural of malakos, which means soft. In the ancient world, Jew and Gentile, malakoi were effeminate men who dressed and acted like women. Both Jews and Gentiles would describe that. Malakoi might put on perfume and makeup like women. Others would, Dr. Sprinkle says, shave their chest. Some Romans believed a naked chest meant the man was the receiver in homosexual sex. Although malakoi doesn't immediately convey homosexuality. Malakoi might have engaged in homosexual sex, and they might not have. And again, some scholars argue malakoi were the receivers in anal sex. The other pertinent word here is arsenokoitai, a word that appears in both of these passages. Now, arsenokoitai is a word that scholars say Paul was the first to use. He's the first in the ancient world to use the phrase arsenokoitai. In fact, it's possible that he himself coined the phrase, and it's a compound word from two words in the Greek Septuagint, again the Greek Old Testament. Arsen, male, and koita, bed. Or koita means to sexually sleep with, or in Latin we come across that word coitus, which means to meet together, to have sexual union, to have sexual intercourse. And the background for arsenokoitai is that in Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, both those verses condemn male homosexuality. In the Septuagint's translation, again the one that Paul would be familiar with, the words arsenos, man, and koiton, lie down with, in the Septuagint, those words appear adjacent one another. Many scholars argue that arsenokoitai indicated the giver in anal sex. If malakos indicates the receiver, arsenokoitai is indicating the giver. Other Jews, after Paul's time, similarly looked down upon men having sex with men as sinful, and they did so like Paul by quoting or referring to Leviticus 18 and 20. Still more, for centuries after Paul, ancient Christian writers will understand Paul similarly, which is that Paul says God condemns male homosexual sex. And please know, just for sake of context, that very position was widespread among Jews 500 years before and 500 years after Jesus and Paul. Indeed, perhaps important for our own current situation, you should know that no first century Jew or Gentile writer argued in favor of homosexuality. Now, in 1 Timothy 1, verse 10, Paul lets us know he is framing his teaching on sin in light of the law, which means the Old Testament law, the Mosaic law. And again, we would find that in the Hebrew and Greek Bibles of Paul's day. And again, that matters, law. He's framing it in light of law because it helps us understand Paul thinking about male on male sex in light of established first century Judaism. And in first century Judaism, homosexual sexual penetration was described as a form of idolatry or a form of adultery. So all of that context, all of Judaism in the first century is viewing this as adultery. But still, just to be clear, Paul doesn't stop and clarify either malakos or arsenokoitai for us in these verses. He's merely listing them off as things that bar us from God's salvation. But we are not left in the dark concerning Paul's meaning, because the historical context gives us important clues for our understanding. To wit, male homosexuality is against God's will and therefore sinful. What Paul's saying in these three passages, in these three letters, is that God forbids all extramarital sexual intercourse. Heterosexual, homosexual, male and male, female and female, male and female, female and male, all of that which is extramarital is sinful. We are safe to say that Paul gave zero thought to males living together or women living together in committed unions. However, we understand those. He gave zero thought to homosexual committed unions that would involve homosexual intercourse. And yet we do know by implication from all that we've said above that Paul could neither have encouraged Christians to engage in homosexual intercourse, because Christians who would do that would be sinning just like the non-believers who were sinning that way. Paul couldn't have said that, nor, as some church folk say today, nor can we say that Paul would have affirmed that committed homosexual unions are blessed by God. He wouldn't have encouraged Christians to engage in homosexual intercourse, and he wouldn't have affirmed committed homosexual unions, because like Jesus, Paul taught that marriage and with it sexual intercourse were reserved exclusively for a man and a woman, two who are alike but not the same, two within the covenantal union of marriage established by God. So, you guys, in the end, through all of this, Paul both said more than Jesus. After all, he was witnessing a resolutely Gentile, a resolutely pagan context. He said more than Jesus, but he stayed true to Jesus' teaching. Jesus, because he was preaching his gospel almost entirely to a Jewish audience, and because he was arguing about the law with Jewish rabbis, Jesus did not speak directly toward homosexual sex. There would have been no argument, no discussion there for them. But we do know Jesus affirmed the Jewish position on marriage as we find it in Genesis 1 and 2, that sex and marriage are for a man and a woman. Conversely, Paul, who was ministering in a Gentile context, found himself speaking with regard to that Gentile context. And we know, again, that Gentiles had quite different standards, or less exclusive standards, about sexual intercourse than did the Jews. Wow, Ed. That's a boatload of technical and historical detail. Yep. The truth is found in the details. Words mean things. Words convey meaning. because Paul's words have too commonly been taken out of context, both his own grammatical context and his own Jewish cultural historical context. All manner of teaching has resulted today that Paul would find both bewildering and scandalous. For me, as I follow Christ, human nature is real. Human nature is dynamic and plastic and adaptable, but it is ever present. What my 2.5-year-old granddaughter is struggling with in her own growth cycle was going on 100,000 years ago. What Paul struggled with internally regarding sin, go read Romans 7. And what Paul was witnessing regarding sin in his Gentile context, it's the same stuff we find ourselves struggling with today. Not only does biology determine our beings, so too do our hungers and aches and yearnings. And I'll have more to say about this in a follow-up episode. But sometimes our hungers and aches and yearnings are given to us, and they're not always dynamics we choose. Sometimes we find ourselves struggling with things that we didn't choose and don't appreciate. And sometimes we find ourselves in a fight with sin that is overwhelming and painful. And sometimes, like Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, we find ourselves struggling with a thorn in the flesh, a bugger, an annoyance, a sticky wicket that just won't easily be cast off. But even with all of that said, there's more. Because neither Jesus nor Paul nor the New Testament, none of those end with sin or God's judgment. So neither today can we, neither today can I. If in Romans 1 Paul decries a depraved mind, in Romans 12 he exclaims that our minds, through the mercy and grace of God, can be transformed. The whole Bible looks for the transformation of our hearts. And Paul here in 12 holds out the hope of grace that is ours for the possibility of the transformation of our minds. The beautiful thing about the living God, with Him and through Christ, mercy triumphs over judgment. Jesus, the man who was far more than a man, died for all humanity. Are you struggling with a sin? Mercy triumphs over judgment. Do you feel helpless before some sinful tendency? God's mercy triumphs over judgment. Feel like you just can't win as you struggle with some sinful tendency? God wants to extend grace and forgiveness. No, the Bible never excuses sin. Yes, the Bible holds out mercy and grace for we sinners. Jesus, John's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 14, Jesus was full of grace and truth. He came and spoke the truth, but he offered grace because he is himself grace. Jesus came and spoke the truth about the human condition. We are racked with all manner of brokenness and need and contrary willfulness to God's ways. But Jesus also held out grace to sinners like you and me. On the one hand, we Christians must hold out the hope of God's grace and transformation. On the other hand, we need to walk in humility and repentance. My friend, Dr. Greg Ostring, he brilliantly says that while humility is never noted as a fruit of the Spirit, humility is fertilizer for all the fruits. None of the fruits work without humility. The fruits grow down inside of humility. And you guys, as we think about this and all other kinds of sins, we need to be humble. We need to be slow to throw stones, because after all, none of us is without sin. Oh my goodness, there is so very much more to be said about human sexuality and what happens in and to us and God's will for all of that. Today we needed to understand just what it is that Paul said God condemns. We needed to do some hard digging. So, thank you dearly for listening. Go in the grace and mercy of God. And please, you know this. Turn your brains on, everybody.